This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Caleb Fuller. Dr. Fuller is assistant professor of economics at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. He has published papers in journals such as Public Choice and the Review of Austrian Economics, and is the author of the 2021 book, No Free Lunch: 6 Economic Lies You've Been Taught and Probably Believe. He wrote a recent piece, so I guess it's not that recent now, but a couple months ago for Mises.org entitled Our Economic Illiteracy, which we are going to be discussing on the show today. Dr. Fuller, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Alex. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I'm really excited about this one. We had some scheduling, issues trying to get this together, but the article was excellent, and I read your book in the interim, which was fantastic. So I'm really excited to dive into these issues. But before we get started, just tell my audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and your work.
Sure. Well, I'm an associate professor of economics at Grove City College, where many of your listeners may know that Hans Sennholz, who was a student of Ludwig von Mises, taught for about 36 years. That was before my time, but I did my graduate work at George Mason University, where I was delighted to study with another Grove City graduate, Peter Boettke, who had Sennholz for a teacher while he was an undergraduate. And so Boettke has influenced my thinking on many matters. And in returning to Grove City, I was really thrilled to be coming full circle while kind of doing my part to keep that intellectual heritage alive at my alma mater. In terms of my research interests, I'm really interested in the economics of institutions, which examines the rules that govern social interaction. So, how do those rules arise? Why do they persist? What problems are they solving? And so on. Sometimes that area is just summarized as governance. As an example, I'm working on a paper with a former student of mine about how community-supported agriculture arrangements, sometimes known as CSAs, how those provide quality produce to consumers, even though they don't avail themselves of highly specified contracts. So in that paper, we're looking to answer why farmers, why do they eschew those sort of contractual stipulations, and then what forces curtail the ability of the farmers to cheat consumers in the absence of such contractual safeguards. And then I guess the last thing I just say is that because I have taught so many introductory students at Grove City, I've really developed kind of a secondary teaching and research interest in the idea of economic errors, economic fallacies, and basic economic reasoning. That's where I think most economists can have the most impact on the world, on society, is by communicating the basic principles. And so that was the focus of my first book that you were very kind to mention, No Free Lunch. And I suspect that will be mostly what we discuss today as well.
Yeah. So what made you want to become an economist in the first place? Because it is a very specialized field and it requires a lot of training, at least to be an effective economist. What made you want to go into that career path?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you're definitely insightful to say that most people, aren't really exposed to economics proper, even in high school. I was maybe a little bit unusual in that respect, in that I was fortunate enough to take a high school class that assigned an old, relatively obscure textbook by the great conservative American thinker Russell Kirk. And that book was called Work and Prosperity. Now, if I were to kind of flip through that text today, I might not endorse every jot and tittle of his approach, but when I was 16, that book was a real revelation because it really made sense of things that I hadn't understood before, such as the fact that prices aren't just like these arbitrary numbers that are slapped onto the side of goods that we want to buy. It also raised new questions that I hadn't been exposed to, like why and how things go haywire when we forcibly tinker with those prices. And I was forced to realize that, things can really only go haywire through intervention if there's an underlying orderliness, an underlying regularity to the social world. And that's what really struck me, impressed me about economics then. I think it's what still really strikes me about economics today. Economics, I was shown through that text, is clearly not just a collection of interesting and ad hoc empirical facts about the world, but rather it provides a framework that offers a really systematic, unified way of accounting for social phenomena. So that was kind of my first introduction. I should mention I also owe a lot to my Grove City professors, who are now my colleagues, for repeatedly demonstrating the complementarity between good economic theory and Christian theology. So this orderliness, this regularity to which I was just mentioning, I was just alluding to this, those things I think are reflections of God's wisdom as it pertains to the social world. And so studying economics can be an avenue for learning more about the mind of the Creator, understanding more of His glory. And so toward the end of my undergraduate studies, it really dawned on me that I wanted to devote my life to making sense out of the social world and doing my best to communicate that sense of wonder that I had experienced to a new generation of students. That's sort of my story, I guess, in a nutshell.
Well, you are an adherent to the Austrian tradition of economics, and I know that there are a lot of people on my show that are going to be familiar with that label. So what does that mean, though, when we're talking about the basic principles of Austrian economics? Kind of talk to us about what the label means, and then what some of the adherents of that particular school of economics endorse.
Sure. I mean, it's a big question, but it's also an important question. In a really important sense, there's no such thing as Austrian economics, which might shock somebody. Hopefully, they don't turn the podcast off when they hear me say that. But hold on just a second, because really what I'm getting at is the same sentiment that Milton Friedman, who was no Austrian himself, was kind of trying to communicate when he said that there's only good economics and bad economics. There's not Austrian economics or Chicago economics or something like this. Just like there's not Austrian physics or Austrian math. Or Austrian, calculus, to take a subfield of math. So economics is a science. It's a humane science, however, which means that its methods, the way it approaches the discipline, the phenomena under question, those methods are different from the natural sciences, but it is a science nonetheless. Economics occupies really the same ontological status as physics does, but its epistemological procedures are different from physics. They are suited to the sciences of man rather than to the sciences of matter, like physics is. So with all that kind of out of the way, you might wonder, well, what is this intellectual tradition? How did it get its name? Why is it distinct? And so the term Austrian economics was initially a term of opprobrium. It was used derisively. In the 19th century, there was an intellectual battle called the Methodenstreit, which is just a big fancy German word for dispute over method. The two most prominent members of that debate were Karl Menger, who's the fountainhead of Austrian economics, and Gustav Schmoller, who was Menger's opponent, and he led a tradition that we now call the German historical school. It's largely defunct. But briefly, those two sides, they had a big argument over whether there was such a thing as universal economic law that applies in all times and in all places. And so Menger and his followers answered that in the affirmative. Schmoller and his followers denied this idea, arguing for what is called historicism, which is the idea that all that we really have when we come to the social world are different historical eras, different historical epochs, and those epochs may be governed by forces that are unique to that period, but that there's no overarching principles that apply to all human action and thus across time and space. Schmoller, incidentally, was a German, and German thinkers tended to see Austria as kind of being an intellectual backwater during the time. I mean, you can probably rattle off a whole bunch of German intellectuals. So in one of Schmoller's essays, he just derisively referred to the Mengerians as, quote, those Austrians, and the term stuck. So, I mean, it has a sort of anticlimactic origin story for the term. But I think you could say that the most enduring legacy of the Austrian tradition was to put a stake in the ground regarding the existence and then also the nature of economic law. Now, I don't know if you want to jump in there. There's a lot more I could say about what makes Austrian economics distinct in the contemporary world.
Yeah, I definitely want you to do that, and then maybe talk about some of the most influential Austrian economists.
Sure. So, Karl Menger was particularly notable because not only was he part of this Methodenstreit, but he was also a key figure in the most notable event in the history of economic thought for all time. And that was a paradigm shift called the Marginal Revolution. And that Marginal Revolution, while it happened in the 1870s, is relevant to this question about contemporary economics because it is really where all contemporary economic theorizing begins. All modern economists, trace their intellectual heritage back to the 1870s with the marginal revolution. And so there were three men who stumbled upon a solution kind of concurrently. That was Carl Menger, William Stanley Jevons, and Leon Walras. And what they were puzzling over was this thing called the diamond water paradox. And briefly, it just said, hey, it seems puzzling that a good as important as water is so very cheap, whereas something that's very frivolous like diamonds is really expensive. And the marginal revolutionaries, so-called, they solved that quandary by pointing out that water is extremely abundant, whereas diamonds are not. And so the additional, or what they would say, the marginal unit of water in most contexts is not very valuable because we've already satisfied our most important ends that water would allow us to achieve. Diamonds are much less abundant, which means the additional or the marginal diamond satisfies a relatively more important goal. Of course, you can change the context, which would change the result. And this was clearly part of the marginalist solution. If you're dying from thirst in the desert, then you're going to pay much more for water than you would for a diamond. Okay. That might almost seem obvious to us moderns, but that's really because the marginal revolutionary way of thinking has seeped into our consciousness. That puzzle had flummoxed, some of humanity's greatest minds. So, Aristotle did not have a solution. Plato didn't. Nicholas Copernicus, who, is developing this idea of heliocentrism. So not exactly, someone who's slow, right? He wrestles with it. John Locke, Adam Smith, we have a whole host of the smartest people. And then it was these marginal revolutionaries that offered this kind of disarmingly simple solution to this. Okay. But if we were to, kind of fast forward into the present day, many of the best parts of Austrian economics, I think, have been absorbed into the mainstream. Like, for example, this marginalist solution, the idea of opportunity cost, was developed by Austrian economists initially as well. But of course, all economists will make reference to this idea. But I think nowadays, the things that would distinguish Austrian economics from the conventional approach is they take the idea of subjective value more seriously and I think more consistently. So they extend it to things like people's expectations of the future or the knowledge that they have. Austrians are more interested in adjustment processes in the real world rather than simply describing equilibrium state of affairs or what the state of rest looks like. That would be a key difference. In macroeconomics, there are some even more salient differences. So Austrian economists treat capital goods as being heterogeneous, which just means that they recognize that capital goods are not all equally suited to every stage of an economy's production structure. And that point, which kind of sounds, again, I think, mundane, it has important implications for why the economy has recessions and depressions. And so the Austrian business cycle theory is distinct from those that dominate the contemporary economic scene. So again, there's much more that could be said. I think you also asked about some of the major figures in Austrian economics. Okay, so after Carl Menger, the most important one, sort of in the second generation, was a fellow named Eugen von Boom-Bawerk. And he made really important contributions to capital, like I was just referencing, an interest theory. He formulates a very useful approach to supply and demand analysis. He also pens a very effective refutation of Karl Marx in the late 1890s, which convinces a large swath of economists not to be Marxist. And in the third generation is when you have Ludwig von Mises, who I'm sure your listeners have heard of. And then Mises in turn influences F.A. Hayek, who wins the Nobel Prize in economics in 1974, I believe it is. And then moving kind of into what you could call the contemporary era, you have figures like Murray Rothbard, Israel Kirzner as well. And so those names that I just listed would be considered the most preeminent.
Well, I gotta tell you a really quick embarrassing story. I did not study economics at all until I was in grad school, and I took several years off between undergraduate and graduate school. So it wasn't until I was 26 that I actually took an economics class. And I remember the first time that I opened up the economics textbook, it just blew my mind how much I did not understand how basic economics worked. And so from there, I kind of moved into I started reading some Thomas Sowell, and then eventually I found the Austrian School of Economics, and everything just started clicking, and it all made made so much sense of the world around me and so much sense of the economic problems that we face as a country today. And in the article that you wrote for the Mises Institute, you summarized a lot of very popular economic fallacies, and a lot of the fallacies that were in that article were once beliefs that I had before I started studying economics. They were just things that I took for granted. And if you turn on the news, you'll see these fallacies repeated over and over and over again. So what I want to do is I want to walk through some of the main fallacies that you explored in that article and just have you break them down for my audience, explain why that way of thinking about economics just doesn't work. And I think one of them that is going to be very relevant for our audience because of where we are at right now is the idea that corporate greed causes inflation. I mean, that is the standard line that the mainstream media uses to talk about what's currently plaguing our economy right now. It's corporate greed, and that's all that is. So talk to us about why that statement, corporate greed causes inflation, is wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. This so-called greedflation idea has really gained popularity in the last 2 years, as you mentioned, but it's really not advanced by any economists that I'm aware of. I mean, in fact, I think most of the fallacies we're going to talk about are things that all economists would agree are examples of truly fallacious reasoning. So it's not like it's unique to the Austrian perspective per se. I mean, they might have additional nuances to add. But one of the things that this idea that corporate greed is what's driving inflation really illustrates is that intentions do not guarantee outcomes. And I think if we can keep that idea kind of in the forefront of our mind as we talk about all of these fallacies, then we'll be off to a much better start than most people are when they confront this kind of idea. So that idea, intentions don't guarantee outcomes, that's true for private parties. It's true for public policymakers. So let's apply it here to private parties. Managers or shareholders of corporations, they might be greedy. They might have greedy intentions, greedy designs, but that does not guarantee a greedy outcome. So in the case that we're talking about here, we're trying to explain something that is changing, namely prices. And so we're not going to appeal to something which is invariant, namely human greed. That really violates basic scientific tenets that are held in common across really every scientific enterprise. So how does that play out here? Well, greed has been with us since mankind's fall into sin, Genesis 3, right? It cuts right through every human heart. An analogy I think might help. If you and I, Alex, were investigating a plane crash and someone said that they had determined that gravity was the cause of that crash, we probably would not be very satisfied with that explanation. We'd send them back to the crash site and say, you've got work to do. And why would we say that? Well, we would say that because gravity is a constant, which 99.99999% of planes are overcoming at any given moment. So what you and I want to know is what is particular to this specific plane crash? And if our investigator can answer that, then we'll say, okay, now you have a more satisfactory explanation of this event. So likewise, let's just go ahead and assume that executive and or shareholder greed isn't something that fluctuates on a day-to-day or month-to-month or even year-to-year basis. And if it did, of course, we'd have to attribute price decreases to a sudden surge of corporate altruism, maybe, or maybe to buyer greed, since buyers are always looking for the lowest prices. But you never hear any of the greedflation proponents kind of take their framework to its logical conclusion, which is, that's where you would end up. Okay. So the economic point of view rather would have us ask, well, what constraints changed which allow firms to increase their prices now when they presumably couldn't increase their prices beforehand? So a constraint in economics, that's just something that defines what's possible. Okay. So we're asking what changed to make a higher price a possibility now when it wasn't a possibility before. And the economic point of view, which I think is the correct point of view, says, well, there has to be a change in the relationship between money and the goods that money buys. And empirically, the change almost always means an increase in the amount of money. So more money chasing the same number of goods, or to say the same thing, an increase in demand for most goods in the economy. And when that happens, sellers find that they can raise their prices without losing as many sales as compared with prior to that demand change occurring. So that's the constraint that has changed. Now, mind you, businessmen have been a convenient scapegoat for the government's inflationary activities over time. We mentioned Mises a couple moments ago, and he has this great speech in which he says something like the following. He says, the governments try to find somebody who is responsible, but not the government. They consider the man who asks for higher prices responsible. Here he's talking about inflation. But he must ask for higher prices because there are now more people wanting to buy his produce, end quote. So this tendency to scapegoat the sellers themselves, which is what the greedflation theory does, that's an old trick in the book of government officials or popular commentators. In fact, the economists Richard Wagner and James Buchanan, who himself won the Nobel Prize in 1986, they also allude to this scapegoating as a pernicious effect of monetary inflation in their great classic book, Democracy in Deficit, which I recommend to all of your listeners. What they do in that book, among other things, is they argue that inflation undermines the confidence that people have in markets. And it undermines the respect that they have for private property because they see all of these outcomes that they disapprove of, and they attribute it to the private property system. They see businessmen raising their prices. They assume businessmen are therefore the ones who are ultimately responsible for those increased prices, responsible for the pinch that they feel. So, in many ways, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And this idea of blaming the market participants for something that government did is really an old trick in the book.
The next concern that you address in your piece is the idea that price controls are an effective way of controlling this inflation. So in other words, people think that, well, we see all these prices going up across the economy. Why can't the government just step in and say that we're going to cap the price at a certain, gas is not going to go over $3 a gallon. What's wrong with that line of thinking?
Good question. I mean, yeah, you're right. Whenever people talk about inflation, price controls seemingly aren't far behind, despite the fact that you'd be hard pressed to find a policy issue that generates more consensus among economists. I mean, when you poll members of the American Economic Association on, whether or not we should impose price controls, is something like high 90% say, no, don't ever do that. So there are kind of two cases that people might have in mind. I mean, the one more drastic case is imposing price controls, price ceilings on virtually all the goods in the economy during inflation. An example of this in real life would be during World War II. In the United States, the government placed price controls on about 80% of the economy's goods. So let's think about that case first. When that happens, when prices are suppressed below the market price, it gives rise to systemic shortages. So at an artificially lowered price, people want to buy more units of the goods than sellers are willing to make available of those goods. And that in turn has severe effects on productive economic activity. So it prevents sellers from accurately assessing profit and loss. Supplies and demands are changing in the economy, but prices aren't being allowed to change to reflect those changes in supplies and demands. And so producers don't receive appropriate feedback about which goods to produce, how to produce them efficiently, and so on. With these massive shortages of goods arising, people begin to seek to purchase goods outside the country. So you tend to get an outflow of domestic currency when price controls are placed across a lot of goods. And that ironically leads to higher prices in other countries. So, sometimes the way that economists describe this is that inflation can be exported, like it becomes one of our exports to other nations. So to kind of summarize all those effects, the price controls end up making people poorer, first by destroying the ability of producers to calculate profits and losses. And then second, price controls make people poorer since they're expending resources trying to figure out workarounds to those price ceilings, whether it's going to foreign markets or trading in black markets domestically. A second case that people might have in mind might be sort of what you were alluding to, where you brought up gas. Okay, so let's place a price ceiling on goods that are widely consumed, such as gasoline. During inflation, politicians can really garner some support by promising to stick it to those sorts of sellers, to go back to our notion of scapegoating. And gasoline is a great example because so many people use it. We could think about the case of President Nixon's ceilings on gasoline, which he imposed in the 70s, and then in the early 70s, and later they were reinstated in the late 70s. And so that generated long lines at the gas stations as people were seeking to purchase more gas at a lower price. The gas stations were also cutting back on what they were willing to offer. And so that waiting in line is a really wasteful way to acquire a good relative to paying for the good through offering cash in exchange for it. Because when you wait in line, that's a pure cost to the buyer that doesn't get translated into the seller's benefit, which is what happens in a normal economic exchange. I offer you cash. That's a cost to me, but it's a benefit to you because you now have money. Okay. So there was just waste built into the idea of a price ceiling. But more interestingly than that, with gas stations running out of gasoline after only a few hours, you had this phenomena arise of people getting stranded on their road trips. And so it became very difficult to actually plan any sort of long distance travel because you never knew which gas stations would be open. Meanwhile, these sellers at the gas station, they're facing these long queues of people looking for gas. And so they want to turn that queue to their advantage. And in this particular case, what happened was gas stations began to introduce things like car washes or oil changes or pumping up your tires. And so the result was that I should mention, the reason they introduced these was they said, okay, if you want to purchase this kind of add-on, then you can hop the queue, you can jump to the front of the line and not wait in line for 3 hours. And so the result was that people competed to get gas by way of all these wasteful purchases on a car wash, on oil, whatever, that they wouldn't have done otherwise. Well, the most interesting result to me of these price ceilings, though, was how they redistribute wealth. Okay, so this is kind of a common result under price ceilings. And that's because price ceilings only dictate one element of the exchange between buyers and sellers, namely the price. In the Nixon case, the price ceiling said, hey, a gas station is not able to charge a price higher than the highest price they charged in the last 90 days. That's how the edict went out. Well, gasoline is not homogeneous. There's high quality, low quality, high octane, low octane. And so what happened was that the high octane gasoline sellers were charging higher prices than the low octane sellers. The high octane sellers then swapped out their high octane gas for low octane gas, but they kept their price the same. Okay. So as a result, a buyer could either go to a low octane gas station and wait in line for hours to get their gas, or they could go to a formerly high octane station that is now selling low octane gas and not wait in line as long because the price was higher. Okay, so I could either pay a high price for the low octane gas, or I could wait in line a long time for the low octane gas. And so you saw a bunch of people shift over to the formerly high octane sellers. They would pay that higher price for the low octane gas, which meant that the sellers of formerly high octane gas saw their profits rise because, while their revenues stayed about the same or maybe even increased a bit, their costs of production fell because they were buying low octane gas from the refineries instead of that high octane gas. So that general principle that a price control changes the allocation of income and wealth is really a universal one. And you can see that show up whether we're talking about a minimum wage or whether we're talking about rent control or what have you.
And that's what I want to turn to next, because the minimum wage, especially with people that are our age, the minimum wage is one of those economic fallacies that almost everybody universally accepts. Everyone thinks that the workers are getting screwed over, and we can help them all by just giving them $15 an hour or $20 an hour or whatever it is. What's the problem with the minimum wage? Why are there economic issues that are associated with that?
Yeah, well, I think the way I put it in the article was something like, the fallacy says the minimum wage is a free lunch to low-skilled workers. So that is demonstrably false. The minimum wage is another price control. This time it's a price floor, meaning that prices can't go underneath it. And so I think to grasp what happens with the minimum wage, it's instructive to first think about what happens in a free market. In free markets, competition between employers is always driving people's wages to equal the revenue that a worker is responsible for contributing to an employer's bottom line. But that process is not instantaneous, and it's also not perfect. It's therefore possible for somebody to be contributing $7.25 an hour, but only be getting paid right now $5 an hour. And in that sort of environment, someone could indeed experience a $1.25 an hour pay bump due to the federal minimum wage being raised to $7.25 as it is right now. So it is possible to raise the wages of some workers through a minimum wage. But remember, that's really not what my fallacy claimed, right? It said there's a free lunch for low-skilled workers. So at the very least, even in this case where we have a worker who doesn't lose their job, an employer's profits fall, which means that shareholder income falls, which means that the ability to reinvest decreases, and the ability to expand production and grow wealth in the future declines. But I think many people would respond to that economist reasoning and say, well, I don't care about that as long as the poorest people get a little bit of a raise. So economics really can't tell us how to adjudicate that sort of a trade-off, but it can tell us whether the minimum wage is generally an effective tool for raising incomes of the poorest people in society. And here again, the answer is just no, it's not. So consider this scenario. Let's imagine a low-skilled teenager. They're contributing $5 an hour. And suppose they currently earn only $4.50 an hour. Then a minimum wage of $7.25 gets passed. The key thing to grasp, really the key takeaway, is that a minimum wage does not require employers to hire a worker, okay, or to hire the same number of workers that they would hire without the minimum wage. It really only stipulates the monetary terms of compensation if they do choose to make a hire. That's it. Our teenager who contributes $5 an hour is no longer profitable to employ. If an employer wants to just throw away $2.25 an hour, they would be free to just flush that down the toilet, right? Of course, doing that kind of thing won't last long because firms operate in a competitive market where that kind of waste tends to be, exposed by rivals that are more effective. So the minimum wage does cause those kind of workers to either lose their jobs or not get hired in the first place. And so, as I like to point out to my students, the true minimum wage for those workers is really $0.00, because that happens to be the wage that you earn when you do not have a job, it turns out. And so, to my mind, there really shouldn't be as much controversy about this point as there is. Everyone understands it intuitively for every other good. If the law compelled apples to sell for no less than $10 an apple, people would buy fewer apples than they do right now, and they would shift to substitutes like pears. Likewise, when employers face a minimum wage, they shift to substitutes like capital goods. An example would be the kiosks that so lovingly greet you when you enter a McDonald's or a Panera. So, trying to keep ourselves anchored to this fallacy, no, the minimum wage certainly is not a free lunch for workers that lose their job or that don't get hired in the first place. If anything, it's really kind of the bully that comes along and grabs their lunch money. That's probably a better way to think about it. There's actually some recent empirical work that was done on Seattle's minimum wage experiments. And that work showed that the aggregate wage bill, so that's the total amount of income going to the lowest wage workers, that fell due to Seattle's minimum wage experiments, even though some workers did receive a little bit of a bump. Okay, so yeah, there were those workers that received a little bit of a bump, but the fact that a larger number of workers, were laid off, lost their jobs, meant that in the aggregate, the amount of income going to the lowest skilled workers ended up declining. And I'll say just a couple more things about this because I think it's so important. Sometimes people point to studies that show a small or non-existent disemploying effect of the minimum wage. And so they say, okay, that's got to be where the free lunch resides. We found it, right? But even there, the economist David Newmark, he's shown that those papers are really in the minority of empirical minimum wage papers. He's got a great recent meta study of minimum wage papers. So while I sometimes point people to that Newmark paper, that's really not the fundamental point, though, because scarcity will not be cheated, and so something has to give. So let me just mention at least one reason why that result of, hey, we didn't find a disemploying effect, why that's still consistent with economic theory and also inconsistent with the idea of there being a free lunch. And it really goes back to what we were just discussing with the price ceilings on gasoline, and that's that employers can respond to a minimum wage by adjusting other aspects of the employment relationship. For example, they could remove coffee from the lounge, or they could turn off the air conditioner on a hot factory floor. And even more subtle than those kind of things, they could begin monitoring the workers more intensely for things like shirking, because the ability to consume some leisure on the job is a perk of most jobs. Essentially, the employer is responding to the minimum wage by reconfiguring the workers' compensation package in order to reestablish viability as an enterprise. So the point, though, is that even if a worker's wage rises and he remains employed, his raise was not a free lunch because some other goodie that was part of his compensation got yanked away. Okay. And that isn't just a theoretical possibility either. There's another recent paper by Jeff Clemens, Lisa Kahn, and Jonathan Mears, and they show that employers often respond to minimum wages by cutting health benefits for the least skilled workers as a way of reestablishing profitability.
There's another economic fallacy that I want to talk about too that's also very pervasive, and I know that we live in an era where it is almost a social heresy to question the idea of the Civil Rights Act, and we feel like there needs to be a lot of protections put in place to make sure that minority workers are not discriminated against in the workforce. And the idea behind that is that if those guardrails are not in place, then there would be thousands of employers that would discriminate against minority employees. So the economic fallacy here that I want to address is the idea that racial discrimination is costless to the discriminator, that there's no cost that's being borne by the employer who refuses to hire or work with people that are not of their same ethnicity. What's wrong with that mentality?
Yeah, well, that's a great way to set it up. I mean, there are many contexts where discrimination can occur, but what I had in mind when I said the fallacy is that racial discrimination is costless, what I had in mind was just the basic employer-employee relationship. And I was thinking of what economists call taste-based discrimination, which I think is what most people are thinking about when they decry discrimination. So taste-based discrimination happens when a person treats another group differently, purely out of spite, arising from observable difference, such as your sex or your skin's melanin content. And so the fundamental reason why that kind of taste-based discrimination is not costless is because voluntary interaction is beneficial, and a discriminator forgoes the benefits, those gains from trade, economists would say, when they discriminate. So it's important to realize that doesn't mean that discrimination will never happen, but it just means that the higher the cost of discriminating, the less discrimination we'll tend to see. And that's, I think, a little bit abstract. So I like to give an example that comes from a mid-20th century paper by Armin Alshin and Ruben Kessel. Alshin was one of the 20th century's great microeconomists. Highly recommend looking up some of his papers and reading them. But in this paper, what they notice is that early 20th century Jewish graduates of Harvard's MBA program, they did not enter industries in the same proportions as their non-Jewish Harvard MBA graduates. And during this period, Jews were often discriminated against in American society. But Alshin and Kessels wondered, well, why does it seem like then they are being discriminated against more in some industries as opposed to others? It doesn't seem very compelling to think that, well, the racist employers just happen to cluster together in some industries, but not in others. All right. Well, if I were to simplify Austrian and Kessel's argument just a tad, what they find is that Jews were disproportionately underrepresented in industries where government intervenes to cap the profits that firms can legally earn. Okay, so why does that have any connection to discrimination? Well, I think we can think through a numerical example. Suppose an employer advertises for a job opening that'll pay $100,000 annually. And there are two applicants. The first is an Englishman who will contribute $110,000 a year to the company, and the second is a Jewish man who will contribute, let's say, $120,000 a year. And let's suppose that, unbeknownst to both of these applicants, the employer has a bias against Jewish people. But you might wonder, well, does he dislike them enough to pass on $10,000 a year? And the answer is, he might. Some people are just that, racist, just that prejudiced. But it does raise the question of how long that employer can survive in a competitive market where he's intentionally making this wasteful decision, where presumably there are some other folks who are not racist and so forth. Okay. Now, suppose for simplicity that the government caps profits so that no employer can make more than $10,000 in profit on any hire that they make. So anything over $10,000 in profit would just go to the government. Okay. And in that scenario, then the prejudiced employer, he's most certainly not going to overcome his biases to hire this Jewish applicant. Why would he saddle himself with this employee that he doesn't like just for the privilege of bestowing an extra $10,000 on the government, right? So in other words, a profit cap, it reduces that natural cost of racial discrimination that does tend to exist in voluntary interactions that take place in a free market. And again, it's not all or nothing. We're not saying that discrimination can't happen in free markets. We're not saying that in regulated markets, all you're going to see is discrimination, right? We're talking about more versus less. In these type of contexts, we'll see it more. In these type of contexts, we'll see it less. So that kind of, I hope, gives a sense as to why you can't just say, there's no pattern or systematic tendency in where you're going to see it.
That was great. And that is a common refrain by people on the left. The next one that I want to address is a very common frame or a very common, saying by people on the right. And that's the idea that China is beating us in trade. So what is wrong with the state? Because really, that's what you hear from a lot of conservatives. They're always harping about how China has an economic advantage and they're going to wind up outpricing the United States. And they just got us beat economically. And we have to regulate, we have to impose tariffs and quotas and all those kinds of things on Chinese goods. What's wrong with the idea that China is beating us in trade?
Yeah, well, I like the point that you made about, fallacies can exist on the ideological left or right because economics is really kind of an equal opportunity offender of political ideologies, So this claim that you brought up, China beating us at trade, that's demonstrably false as well, for the simple reason that trade is not an activity where one side wins while the other side loses. And, I'm somewhat tempted to just stop my answer there, but of course there are many more nuances to this. So I'll do my best to walk through some of those. Trade is an activity with two winning parties. So this fallacy really misconstrues the nature of the social interaction that we refer to as trade. So I'll do my best to unpack that. And there's a lot of complicated side issues that could arise here. So let's leave aside questions about, the extent to which Chinese producers are using slave labor or the extent to which there might be, or I think there's a good evidence for Chinese genocide of the Uyghur people. Okay. So I'm leaving those issues aside for the moment, not because I don't think they're important, but because, we want to analyze this issue pertaining directly to trade. Is it possible that something called China is getting ahead by way of trading with something called, the US, which is falling behind by way of trading with China? If that's the nature of the claim, then it is false. There's another kind of false premise baked into this succinct fallacy. China and the US are not acting entities, and thus they cannot trade with anyone. really what's happening is individual people in China are entering into voluntary exchanges with individual people in the United States. And since people only initiate voluntary exchanges when they anticipate they will gain from doing so, trade yields these positive sum outcomes. That's not to say that nobody ever experiences buyer's remorse, but only that both parties to an interaction, they anticipate gains from trading. Okay. So contrary to popular belief, free international trade tends to benefit the average American the most. If we're looking just at the American side of this equation, okay, the average American benefits tremendously when the price of goods like cars or washing machines falls due to trade. Those goods, they tend to consume a very large fraction of the average consumer's budget. So American consumers really can feel the impact of lower prices for those goods. And that's why I really wanted to draw our attention to the average American. Sometimes critics of trade think that we are throwing like the average American person under the bus for some other ideal, like natural rights or something. Okay. And that's not at all the case. Does Bill Gates really care whether his washing machine is a little bit cheaper this year? I mean, clearly he doesn't, right? But I certainly do. Okay, as being someone who's much closer to the average income in America. So to kind of return to the basic economics of it, what free trade does fundamentally is it allows Americans to specialize in producing what they can produce at the least cost, while foreigners also specialize in producing what they can produce at the least cost, with both parties ultimately coming together to share in that joint abundance. A quick kind of reductio ad absurdum regarding the benefits of trade versus protectionism is to imagine what would happen to a household's standard of living if no one in that household was permitted to buy from anyone outside of the household. Okay. And yes, this is a difference from protectionism, but it's really a difference of degree rather than kind. I mean, if we were not allowed to trade with anyone outside of the United States, we could still trade among the 50 million Americans or so. And so we would not be nearly as poor as we would if it was, just my household that was cut off from trade with anyone else. But we would be poorer than if we could trade with the rest of the world. Okay. Now, one objection says, what about the fact that these Chinese producers are, at best subsidized or outright nationalized at worst? So leaving aside the fact that, U.S. prices are also massively distorted by a host of interventions on our side, the case for free trade benefiting both parties is not contingent on complete laissez-faire in both countries. The Chinese distorting their economy through subsidies or nationalization of their companies, that still allows Americans to consume cheap Chinese products and frees up our labor and capital to go into other lines of production. And to the extent that American labor and capital cannot find other avenues of production, I think it's best to begin by looking at domestic regulations that really strangle domestic productive enterprise, and thus they slow these transitions that free trade introduces. There's so much that could be said here. I'll just touch on one other objection, which has to do with the trade deficit. We buy more from Chinese producers than they buy from us. I sometimes call it the so-called trade deficit because it's really an unfortunate kind of moniker. Deficit is a word that has a negative connotation about it. But in this case, there's nothing to worry about. Because when the Chinese receive our dollars in trade, they can really do just one of three things with them. And all of those three things have beneficial effects on Americans. So thing number one that they can do is they can buy our goods, which benefits our exporting producers. Thing number two is they can invest in American companies or buy American debt, which either allows American companies to expand, or it prevents American savings from getting sucked into financing the government debt. Okay, so it prevents interest rates from going as high. Or the third thing they could do is that they can simply hold on to those dollars, which is in some sense the best option of all for Americans, because what it means at the end of the day is it means that we got Chinese goods in exchange for pieces of linen with the faces of dead presidents on them. Okay. So, people should begin to think about exports really as a cost, not a benefit. They're what we have to give up to receive something in return. Um, the way I sometimes try to get people not to be so anxious about the trade deficit is to say, well, are you worried about the trade deficit that you have with Chipotle? Because presumably, right, you're buying a lot more from Chipotle than Chipotle is from you. And if you aren't losing sleep at night over that, then you should think about whether you should lose sleep about the so-called trade deficit with China. There's a lot more that can be said, but I'll try to wrap it up there.
Yeah, no, that was a perfect answer to that question. The next one that I want to talk about is the idea that rent control expands housing availability for the poorest. And I think I never was aware of how much control government wanted to have over apartment complexes and rental units until COVID, when the government stepped in and prevented people from kicking others out of their homes. And it was just wild how all of that worked during the pandemic. So walk us through that idea that rent control expands housing availability for the poorest. What's wrong with that logic?
Yeah, well, here's another instance of a price control. And if I were to connect it back to what I began this whole discussion with, this is a perfect example of something that achieves the exact opposite of the stated intentions. So intentions do not guarantee outcomes. Sometimes we see outcomes that are perfectly contrary to those intentions. When you poll economists, they are essentially unanimous in their opposition to rent control. At the same time, you can graduate from a U.S. high school and I think even a college without hearing a single argument against rent control. And surely that kind of situation does not apply to something like Newton's universal law of gravitation, which I think you couldn't get through college without hearing about. So when people complain, about the state of STEM education in the U.S., I'm always tempted to kind of impishly point out that it's at least miles ahead of economics education. And rent control, I think, provides a really good example of that. I had a very intelligent professor in graduate school who pointed out this glaring omission to us. And he added that, he and his family were against rent control when they were growing up for the very sophisticated reason that they were landlords. So, it was really an epiphany to him when he learned that economics has a whole analysis showing that rent control destroys wealth overall, and that it even hurts the very people that it purports to help, which would be tenants. So, to him, it was kind of a watershed moment to realize, oh, you mean that you can ground your support or opposition to rent control in something other than your identity, right? There's something over and above identity politics. And economics, really is that thing. And that was kind of a watershed moment for me too, in a different way. So to see why rent control does not make housing more abundant, I think it's helpful to think about the short run and the long run. Okay. So think first about the short run and think about like a newlywed couple. Maybe they're living with their in-laws to save money. This was particularly common in the mid 20th century. Now imagine that rent control goes into effect. And they strike out on their own because now housing appears to be more affordable than it was before. And so you get more people that are looking for an apartment unit. Think about that as being the demand side of the market. Now imagine that there's, at the same time, an elderly couple that likes to rent out an extra room in their house. But at the reduced rent, they say, you know what? It's no longer worth it for us to deal with the hassle of strangers traipsing into our house, or the fact that we have to sacrifice personal use of that part of our property. And so they pull that unit off the market. And so while there are more people looking, at the same time, there are fewer units being made available for sale. And so even in that short run period, we see rent control achieving the exact opposite of the stated goal. Remember, the goal was we want to make housing more available, more abundant for the lowest income folks. Now, in that short run period, we might even think, well, how do landlords begin allocating that limited apartment space when rent control forbids them from just selling to the highest bidder like they would in a market? And the answer basically is they begin to discriminate among potential tenants on the basis of something like the landlord's preferred race, or the landlord's preferred sex, or preferred age or appearance. Okay, something arbitrary, in other words. So this connects back to our idea of racial discrimination not being costless. When rent control generates a long queue of people that want an apartment, it thereby also lowers the cost of racial discrimination. Even more likely, landlords might discriminate based on tenants' likely maintenance costs. So, for instance, couples with children or couples that have pets, they would tend to put more wear and tear on a unit than childless couples, or I guess we could call them petless couples. All right. Under that rent control regime, the landlord who's faced with a long line of people who want to rent, he's going to pick through that long line of people to get to the folks that have the lowest maintenance costs, like the childless couple. So it really changes the composition of the people who get housing. So that's all happening in kind of the short run period. But if we look over a longer period of time, that housing shortage that we've already talked about, it tends to get worse. And the reason why it tends to get worse is because rent control lowers the rate of return that entrepreneurs can get from investing in and developing more low-income housing. Meanwhile, rent control does not typically apply to luxury housing or to cooperatives or condominiums. And so the rate of return from investing in those options kind of, it rises relative to investing in the low-income options. And so entrepreneurs may begin shifting their investments out of that low-income opportunity into the high-income space. And that decreases the supply of the low-income housing more. And at the same time, it begins to increase the supply of your luxury apartments, which means that their prices begin to fall, all other things held equal. So in a very ironic twist, one result of rent control may be to give a housing subsidy to a billionaire Manhattanite who's, just looking for like his fifth penthouse property. I think it was the economist Walter Block, who maybe some of your listeners know. He pointed out that if you really wanted to expand housing for the poor, you'd place a price ceiling on every other good except for low-income housing, so that all the investment would stop flowing into those goods and it would flow into low-income housing and really nothing else. I almost hesitate to mention that in public because I don't want politicians to be listening. And they don't seem to have a dearth of bad ideas, right?
Yes.
So there's really good empirical evidence for the idea that this happens. That it shifts the composition of housing stock away from low-income housing and toward high-income housing. Stanford economist Rebecca Diamond is her name. I highly recommend looking up her papers on this. Her and some of her co-authors have found that San Francisco rent control in the 1990s, it reduced the overall housing stock by 15%, which is not a small amount. And then it also shifted the remaining stock toward higher end condos. So those remaining housing units, many of them are getting converted. And similarly, the economist Henry Hansman, he has argued for a similar shifting effect in parts of Western Europe. So the upshot of all this is that rent control does fail to achieve its stated goal. It creates less, not more housing for the poorest residents of urban areas.
Yeah, there are two more fallacies that I want to talk through today. The next one is another one that's very popular on the right, and this is the idea that trade or immigrants steal domestic jobs. So people come over to work in the United States from other countries, and the hardworking American can't find a job to work. What's wrong with that mentality?
Yeah, so you mentioned trade or immigrants. Let me take these kind of in reverse order, since we talked a little bit about trade already. I think some objections to immigration are stronger than others, but this objection that immigrants will steal American jobs is probably the most economically ignorant objection. I can't think of any economists who would formulate it that way. Really, what's behind this objection is the idea that there are no benefits of immigration for the domestic population, and that is false. This fallacy really stems from failure to look for the unseen instead of merely the seen, to kind of use a phrase that Frederick Bastiat was known for. So an immigrant, it's true, may be performing a job that a native-born citizen used to do. That is the seen part of the immigration. But you want to keep your eye on the ball of what happens to that worker who might lose their job. And that is they move into some other production process. Okay. Meanwhile, this immigrant, let's go back to him for a second. He's also a consumer. And so he's going to drive up the demand for workers, which can cause domestic wages to rise. Okay. So the bottom line is that national output tends to rise with immigration because we're able to produce more than we could before. Sometimes people complain by pointing out that this transition can be painful, as some American workers may switch jobs. And it's true that there can be pain with any sort of transition, but markets are places where jobs are repeatedly destroyed and created. Okay, the only alternative to that, the only one, is a society of total stasis, of no innovation, of no change. And that is a society with living standards as they would have been in, say, an ancient agricultural economy, which is truly dreadful for the average person. Okay. As one last check on your reasoning about this, it's always helpful to ask, what empirical patterns would you expect if your theory were true? So if your theory is that immigrants steal the jobs of native-born people, then you should see massive and persistent domestic unemployment in the wake of the large waves of immigration that came, say, to our country, the U.S. here. And you can search the annals of American history, beginning with the first large immigration waves of the 1830s, and you will not find this persistent unemployment that you're looking for. Okay. Or think about the last 70 years for U.S. labor markets, where you have massive entry by women and baby boomers into these markets, but zero sustained increase in unemployment. Okay, so you can make all these points without burying your head in the sand about the potential for new social frictions that immigration can introduce into society. But really, that's not what we were addressing here. This fallacy was strictly about labor markets. So, if I could go back to this idea that the immigrant may contribute to an increase in national output. I mean, one example that's often given is someone who comes to the U.S. and does not have very high productivity simply because they aren't fluent in the language. And what sort of jobs can that person do? Well, an example would be, they can provide babysitting services. And that frees up American labor to go into, labor markets and produce the sorts of things that we produce in the U.S., like something like computer chips or something. Okay, so that's a good example of output rising under immigration. Okay, the second part of this was about trade, right? So the thinking here was, does trade kill jobs? And once again, you can't repeat it enough. The bottom line is that trade creates prosperity. Adam Smith has this famous line where he says, "It is the maxim of every prudent master of a family never to attempt to make at home what it will cost him more to make than to buy." In other words, a household, to go back to that analogy, which imposed tariffs on itself, would not enrich itself by doing that. Smith then continues, this is a famous quote, "What is prudence in the conduct of every private family can scarce be folly in that of a great nation." End quote. So, like immigration, trade is not a job killer on net. Indeed, empirical estimates show exactly the reverse of this, that it's protectionism that destroys jobs on net. Trade restrictions, in other words, I'll say it again, they destroy more jobs than they create. A great example of that comes from the former President Trump's 2018 tariffs on washing machines, which created around 1,800 new jobs at the staggering cost to American consumers of $817,000 per job annually. Okay, that's from a paper by economists at the University of Chicago and the Federal Reserve. And it illustrates the job destroying properties of tariffs, because all you have to ask is, what other jobs might have been created if those resources hadn't been sucked into washing machine production. Of course, trade does reshuffle the types of jobs that are performed in a domestic economy. If Americans cannot compete with the production of foreign steel because it is cheaper, then yes, it's true, American steel production does contract, but the presence of cheaper steel allows a host of other industries for which steel is an input to expand. And if you're talking about a good like steel, I mean, that's probably thousands of industries. I haven't looked, right? But it's certainly no small number. And so once again, Bastiat's observations about the seen versus the unseen, I think, are really relevant here. It's very easy for politicians to point to the highly visible new jobs that are created in steel. But the jobs that tariffs destroy tend to be much more invisible. They tend to be scattered throughout the economy. Okay. And so once again, people complain about the pain involved in the transition from protectionism to free trade. But it's a little hard to see why this group of people, that is those who lose their jobs, why they should be singularly identified and artificially favored by legal restrictions. Okay. Because after all, this cheaper foreign steel does allow other domestic industries, other Americans, to either acquire a job, or if we're talking about an industry, to expand and to hire more workers and so on. Okay. Or you can think about this in reverse. When you impose a tariff, you benefit some workers and industries, those which tend to be very politically visible, and you harm industries and workers and consumers that use the goods that have been subjected to the tariff. Okay. So I think what the critics of free trade are ultimately complaining about, I mean, they would not put it this way, but I'm putting it this way for them, I suppose, is that we live in a world of change. And not ultimately that change stems from a foreign source. After all, a domestic innovator like Henry Ford could also be the source of tremendous job loss, and again, of tremendous job gain through his innovations. And indeed, even in the case of trade causing some visible job loss, it's really not the foreigners who cause that loss, but rather the choices of other domestic citizens who are electing to buy cheaper steel or cheaper washing machines or cheaper cars. Okay. The last thing I'll say here is just that the singular focus on jobs is misguided. Creating jobs is really a cinch when you think about it. You could enslave the entire American populace and you could put them to work. Let's build a pyramid in Iowa, right? And in fact, that's how the pharaohs enriched themselves. But if you were to go back to ancient Egypt, that would not have been a society that was wealthy for the average person, right? Wealth that exists for the average person is a modern phenomenon. What matters is how much output an economy is producing on a per person basis. Free trade allows that per person output to rise, and that's what ultimately results in widespread prosperity.
The final economic fallacy that I want to cover today is probably my favorite. And the reason for this is that when I got my very first job back when I was 16 years old, my first boss, I wanted to work into that job for over 10 years. My boss the entire time was a woman. And my wife, she went to college and she went into business marketing, and I became a teacher. And so my wife makes a lot more money than I do. And I also have the least amount of experience of all of the people that I work with at work. So all of my female coworkers, because I work in an environment where we have a salary schedule, all of my female coworkers make more money than I do. So literally all of the women in my life are earning more money than I am as a man. But I hear all the time that women earn less than men for performing the same work. So what is wrong with the pay gap theory?
Well, if you compare the average incomes of U.S. men and women, it is true that the figure for men would be larger. No argument there. And that very basic comparison is the source of the claim that women make 78, or maybe it's 82 cents on the dollar for every dollar that men make. It's the source of that statistic. What's problematic is the naive discrimination view, which lurks behind this claim, And that view holds that men and women are performing the same tasks, but that employers are systematically discriminating against women by underpaying them, or really to say the same thing, by overpaying men. So once again, I encourage people to ask, if this view were true, what else would it imply? What empirical patterns would we expect to see? Well, first, it would mean the presence of an ample and obvious profit opportunity for employers. Firms would be really leaving money on the table. You might wonder how so? Well, all it would take is one firm that preferred the color green more than it enjoyed holding women down, right? It could fire all its male employees and replace those male employees with women on the cheap who would perform the same tasks with the same results for the firm. The only difference being that now our costs of production are lower, which means that our profits are higher. Now, shareholders of publicly traded firms, they really don't tolerate a firm that is purposely leaving obvious profits on the table. Thus, if there was a firm leaving easy money on the table, shareholders would dump that firm's stock, or they might organize a takeover of that firm's management to replace the managers with those that will strive to maximize profits on their behalf. That is their fiduciary obligation. So, lest this particular firm be outcompeted, lest this firm outcompete all the other firms would jump in on this by hiring women and firing all of their men. Okay, so competition for women would ramp up, which in turn would drive their wages higher. And that process would really continue until women earned what men earned, all other things held equal. And if we look out into labor markets, we clearly don't see that kind of massive rearrangement happening. We don't see men getting fired in droves. So that seems to raise an awkward question. What's more, the discrimination view, I think, raises other awkward questions. For example, notice that shareholders and managers and CEOs and HR employees are not exclusively men. Last I checked, many women occupy those roles. And so the discrimination view would require that it's not just men that are holding women down, but that some women have weaseled their way into these positions and are turning around and immediately holding down other women, right? So it's not just men discriminating against women, it's also women discriminating against women. So I think those are some pretty serious problems for the naive discrimination view. How then do we explain the real gap that does exist between men's and women's salaries? Well, in economics, the Latin phrase ceteris paribus, which translate all else equal, all else constant, it really does a lot of heavy lifting. If you were to look at a man and a woman in the same part of the country doing exactly the same work, exactly the same way, to exactly the same quality, you would expect their wages to eventually equalize. That's what economic theory says. But there are various reasons why men and women are not usually doing the same work. In labor economics, there's a concept called compensating differentials, which refers to a premium that people earn when they do unpleasant or dangerous work. So, for example, fishermen in the Gulf Coast are doing a task that appears pretty similar to the job that fishermen in Alaska are doing. But the supply of Alaskan fishermen is much smaller because the risks up in Alaska due to weather are much larger. So with a smaller supply, Alaskan fishermen tend to earn more than the Gulf Coast fishermen, and we call that a compensating differential. They're essentially getting paid for the additional risk that they undertake. Well, similarly, men tend to value earning higher incomes relative to other on-the-job perks, such as safety or vacation time or stable hours, all things that make jobs nicer and less risky. So to take just one example of many, if you examine a breakdown of people that are earning medical degrees, women disproportionately enter fields like pediatrics, while men disproportionately choose specialties like emergency room surgery. And the latter of these two is much more unpleasant It puts you on call potentially at all hours of the day and night. It is much more likely to get you sued, and so on. Okay, there's just a whole host of reasons that you could bucket as, general workplace-related unpleasantness. And so as a result of that, ER surgeons tend to earn more than pediatricians. Whether that ER surgeon is a man or a woman, relative to a pediatrician, regardless of whether that pediatrician is a man or a woman. So a cynic might conclude, well, men are just greedier creatures because they choose those high-earning jobs that don't give them as much time with their family, whereas women tend to choose jobs that allow for a more balanced work-life situation, or jobs that allow them to prioritize their family more. Okay. But really what's going on there is this idea of compensating differentials. Men are selecting into those areas, right, that give them higher wages and less other good things on the job. And there can be other factors too, like the biological reality that women become pregnant and give birth. I realize that's a little more controversial of a claim anymore. But that takes them away from work when it happens, and that can lower their productivity relative to a comparably aged and comparably skilled man. Okay. And of course, none of this rules out the possibility that there might be some sexism against women embedded in other parts of the social system. I'm not taking a position on that. It's a complicated question, but it's possible. Maybe girls are discouraged from a young age from pursuing high-earning careers. Maybe they're discouraged from STEM or something like this. Okay, people have made these arguments, and I don't really want to adjudicate a sort of nature versus nurture debate on that. My point is only to say that there really is a path toward intellectual consistency that discards the naive discrimination view, but still wants to hold on to the idea that there could be sexism in society. Like it is possible to be an intellectually consistent person and hold to both of those positions.
Well, we have covered a lot of ground on the show today. Both you and I are Christians, and one of the reasons why I started this podcast was to try to see if I could figure out how to synthesize Christian ideas with Austrian economic ideas and with libertarian ideas more generally. And one of the things that I've learned is that there are a lot of Christians on both the left and the right that are just fundamentally ignorant of economics. Like they've never heard the arguments that you've made on this show, and they have no idea how economic thinking ought to operate. And so when they go to the Bible and they start interpreting it, they import all of their assumptions, all of their wrong assumptions about economics back into the Bible. And I've tried to address a lot of that on the show. Why do you think it's so important for Christians to study economics? Like, what's the reason why Christians in particular should study that field of thought?
To my way of thinking, there are at least two compelling reasons for Christians to study economics. The first, let's say, less instrumental, pragmatic reason would just be to better understand the mind of God and to bring him glory in doing that. The intellectual precursors to the Austrian economists were a group of late 16th century thinkers called the late Spanish scholastics. And they were really intellectual heirs to the thought of Thomas Aquinas. What motivated their inquiries was a desire to understand God's design for the universe, the laws that he had established for both the physical world, which tends to get more press when we think about medieval thinkers, but also the social world. And really what they were doing is what we now call science. Science is a search for the laws and regularities that God has created to govern reality. Now, it was their emphasis, though, on illuminating laws of the social world that made these Spanish scholastics very unique for their time. They wanted to think God's thoughts after him, to borrow from the great astronomer Johannes Kepler. That's how he defined science. The heavens declare the glory of God, said the Spanish scholastics, but so do the causal relationships in the social world, and economic inquiry helps us to discover what those are. So when you learn about the law of marginal utility, or when you learn about the law of demand, when you learn about how the division of labor tends to increase the amount of wealth that exists in a society, when you learn any of those things, you are grasping part of God's design for the social world. I think a second reason is maybe a little bit more pragmatic. Second reason to study economics for Christians specifically is that we, as Christians, we are called to care for the least of these, to use the term that Jesus used. And prior to the scholastics, even great thinkers tended to reason solely in terms of moral laws, and this had implications for our ability to care for the poor. Let me unpack that just a little bit. Maybe you could take a somewhat silly example. A king would have been viewed as being morally diminished, let's say, if his public policies, which he had passed to increase people's incomes, if those public policies failed to do that. And so while the scholastics were very in tune with the ethical dimensions of the king's choice, and they wrote a lot about ethics, they were really the first thinkers to systematically add the category of economic law to the already existing category of moral law that everyone pretty much acknowledged in Christianized Europe. And so what the scholastics would have said is, well, actually, a king's decree, it might fail not because that king is himself a wicked person, but rather because his edict was bumping up against the constraint of economic law. And so in Scripture, it's almost cliche to point it out, but Christians are instructed to care for the poor. No question there. But then there is a question that arises. Okay, how can we do that effectively? How can we actually help as opposed to hurting? If intentions do not guarantee outcomes, then we have to provide a satisfactory answer to this question. To quote Ludwig von Mises again, he was fond of saying that economics is a science of means, not ends. Okay. One way that this plays out is economists are always asking, are the means you've selected compatible with achieving the goal that you're seeking? All people of goodwill can agree on the ends. We want to make the poorest people in society better off from a material perspective. But what economics says is, okay, now you have to think about the means. Are the means that you're selecting suitable for achieving that goal? Will a minimum wage law actually improve the plight of the poor, or will it result in lower incomes for many of them? So I think that a compelling reason for Christians to study economics is that if we're actually going to follow our Lord's instructions, we have to get our heads around what are effective means of doing so.
One of my favorite lines in your article was that we are living in a time of unprecedented economic literacy, and that is an absolutely true statement. Besides your book, No Free Lunch, what books or resources would you recommend for those, especially Christians, who want to learn more about economics?
Great question. I think it's hard to beat Henry Hazlitt's 1946, I believe that's the year, his classic book, Economics in One Lesson. There's a reason that it has sold over 1 million copies. You can also, I believe, find it online for free through a variety of organizations right now. I mean, yes, you will encounter a little bit of archaic language or examples, but I mean, that is a very small price to pay for the clarity of Hazlitt's thinking on a whole host of economic issues that you will find to be extraordinarily timeless, But for the examples and the language, you'll say, did he write this book last week? Right? But of course, it was published right after World War II. A longer book that I don't agree with 100% of the conclusions in, but that's not a reason to avoid it by any means, is Thomas Sowell's masterful book, Basic Economics. It's fantastic, especially for understanding how prices arise from and in turn guide human behavior. For more advanced students, Murray Rothbard's book from 1962, Man, Economy, and State, which you could follow up with Ludwig von Mises's book, Human Action. Those books are both a challenge and a joy. Arguably, those are the two most important books in Austrian economics. And Mises's is the most important book ever written in economics, period. So if you just want to cut to the chase and say, okay, I'm going to do it, I want to read the most important work ever written in economics, there is no other book to go to but Mises's Human Action. You will struggle with it, but that's okay. Everyone struggles with it when they come to it, and it's a struggle that has a very large reward, I think, at the end. For a very fun book that is not, a treatise in Austrian economics or something like this, but which is really a masterclass in applying the economic way of thinking to a fun topic, I would suggest my graduate school professor, his name is Peter Leeson. The book is The Invisible Hook, which is, of course, a play on the phrase the invisible hand. He offers very intriguing economic explanations of 17th and 18th century pirate organization and pirate behavior. And then I guess lastly, if you'll permit me a really shameless plug, I'm working on a book right now with Dr. Art Carden, who's a professor at Samford University. That book is titled Mere Economics. And so your listeners probably caught the illusion there. You should think Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson meets C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. We're hoping that book comes out late 24 or early 2025.
That is great. Well, before I let you go, give us a sales pitch for No Free Lunch, which is a really great introduction to economics, and it deals with a lot of the issues that we talked about on the show today. And then where can people find that book and your other work?
Well, thank you for those very kind words. The motivation from that book really came from me repeatedly confronting the fallacies that we have been discussing here. And I was confronting them with my very bright freshmen that I have at Grove City College, where it's a privilege to work. And I kept sort of encountering the same misconceptions over and over again. And I wrote down the 6 that I encountered the most and made a little short book out of them. So if you liked our conversation, you'll probably enjoy my book because it touches on these and related questions in a very similar style. It has a lot of fun examples in it. And I think another good reason to get it is you can read it in an afternoon. So it won't tax you unduly like Mises' Human Action would. In terms of other things I've written, you can find them at my website, calebsfuller.com.
Perfect. Well, Dr. Caleb Fuller, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Alex.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.